Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, The True Cost of Fraud to Travel Agents. This is going to be a panel discussion this afternoon, and we've got some guest speakers on, along with my fellow colleagues. I'm Judy with ARC, and I have Cornelius Haddington, and I have Doug Nass here with me. They are both directors in our risk management area of ARC, and Cornelius is going to be our moderator. I'm just going to say a few words about Cornelius and Doug, and then I will turn it over to our panel to introduce themselves and say a few words about them, and then we'll turn it back to Cornelius to kick this all off. Cornelius has been with us here at ARC for over a couple years. He and his team, which Doug is a part of, what their main focus is looking at the impact of fraud across both our customer groups, which is agency and airline. And Cornelius has been in this business for over 17 years, and collectively with Doug, who's been in this business for over 23 years, and with ARC for 25, we do have a lot of expert knowledge here with us on the phone this afternoon, and along with the panel as well. So before further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, which is going to be Simon Rutherford. He is from Featurespace. He'll turn it over to Trevor Clark after that, who's with Ethoca. And then we'll end it up with Tony Ash from Perseuss. So right now I'm going to turn it over to you, Simon. Just say a few words about yourself, and then we'll go down the line and turn it back to Cornelius.
Great, thanks, Judy. So yeah, Simon Rushforth. I'm a subject matter expert at Featurespace. So my role is to serve as the link between our customer and the product, making sure that when we're delivering it to customers, we meet their needs, and then can identify any areas of potential change needed, and then make sure those go through the engineering process and get delivered to them as they need to be. Background prior to this was started out in payment gateways and processors, so looking at PCI and other products as well, or projects. Then moving into more the travel industry, so I worked for a large travel company in terms of leisure travel, which was TUI Travel, then mobile telco, and then finally at Featurespace. So feeling a little bit short compared to Doug and Cornelius, but around 18 years in the payment space. So over to you, Trevor.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Trevor Clark, one of the co-founders at Ethoca. Been here for 13 years now, and multiple roles throughout the year, starting with CTO, subsequently working to develop some of the merchant sides of our business, and then the card issuing side of our business. And currently I'm focused on business development globally, which is taking a look at how do we accelerate both the merchant and bank success and collaboration on our platforms. And these solutions are all based on how we enable the industry to better collaborate together to drive down fraud, increased acceptance, while improving the customer experience as well. Tony?
Thank you, Trevor. This is Tony Ash calling in from the Washington, D.C. area. I'm Vice President of Perseuss for Business Development, working all the continents, working with our portfolio of airline carriers and OTAs, and identifying best practices and further partnership opportunities. I have 15 years in this travel space, 25 years in financial services altogether. And as we watch this fraud impact this travel sector and continue to grow in the capacity that it is, the need for all of us here on this line is very important. So pleased to be with everyone today.
Right, excellent. Thank you very much, guys, for that introduction, and also for joining us today. And everybody else on the line, thank you for dialing in. We appreciate it. So allow me to set the scene for our panel discussion here today. Throughout the month, this Fraud Awareness Month, we've identified that fraudsters are becoming more sophisticated, and that travel agents are seeming to have a more and more challenging time in keeping these guys at bay. To do so, agents need to have better tools, smarter technology, and more powerful security to protect their business and their customers, along with their business partners. We have explored these areas during the month and identified a number of solutions, best practices, along with some staggering statistics surrounding fraud. But as we wrap up the webinar series, I plan for us to focus on 3 areas that seem to be of greatest concern. First being the impact of fraud, the second, solutions in managing fraud, and a third, the future of fraud. So as we move on to our impact of fraud slide, we want to look here mainly at the data points that show the impact of fraud on the agency community, and of course, most important to all of us, the revenue, the bottom line. We see it at about 0.36 and 0.44% of an agent's revenue can be affected, depending on, of course, on the size of the agent due to fraud. Additionally, costs associated with fighting fraud, managing chargebacks, and of course, doing manual reviews have a further impact on the agency's cost. In addition, we see there that about 1 out of 5 chargebacks that are being disputed end up in a win. Now, over to you guys. You've been looking at this environment for a significant amount of time, and looking at it from all angles. Do you see a shift in these costs to the agents? And if so, are there any better ways of managing the costs associated in managing fraud? What are some ideas that you guys have out that could be applicable here? Tony, you want to take this one on?
Yes, thank you. I'll start, and then we can invite Simon and Trevor in for more. But yes, I would say that one thing that's been very apparent is the value and increasing cost of an ADM, if you will. That rate is roughly around $1,047 per every ADM that's passed back to the agent. This has increased over the last 3 years. I believe it was in the 800 range 2 years ago. It was 661 3 years ago. So in this environment, the cost of a ticket is continuing to get higher. Fraudsters are typically taking the more expensive tickets, playing with a larger dollar rather than a lesser dollar. And in this model, it's often the travel agent sector bears the majority of that cost for that price paid, with very little bit of risk on the part of the airline, because they're able to respectfully issue an ADM. And then the travel agent has limited recourse on that as well too. So certainly we want to emphasize the importance to employ all factors in the acceptance of a customer's credit card transaction, all relevant documents. And it's also important to note that, at the macro level, these fraudsters are very skillful at finding and attacking the weakest point in our value chain. They've shifted dramatically from the airlines' direct websites to OTAs and travel agents in the last couple of years, and they'll go back and forth in a single instance with great speed, and it's very difficult to keep up with them as well too. So very important that we remain vigilant and aware of the tools that can be used to try to prevent fraud, because when you're dealing with an ADM and the impact of fraud, there's an additional roughly 24% administrative cost factor that goes into the time put into addressing an ADM as well too. So it can potentially be addressed more effectively at the beginning of the sales cycle than to bear the entire cost of it at the end of the sales cycle.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah,
this is Trevor. Just to add to that, I think the increase in fraud that we've seen over the past few years has also seen a significant corresponding increase in the friendly fraud as well, which adds to that cost. And not only the cost of what it takes to fight fraud, but also the cost and false declines. And it's something that we've seen here at Ethoca, where 2 years ago we did a study with our merchants in the travel space. We saw a 6% friendly fraud rate in the travel space, but this year we've redid a similar type of engagement with the industry and are now seeing between 30 to 40% friendly fraud. So it's a lot of factors that the agencies are being forced to contend with, and not only fighting fraud, but ensuring that those tools that they invest in don't falsely decline their good customers, which can be even a bigger cost to them in the long term.
Exactly. I mean, we've had a lot of customers come to us, and one of the main things they're looking to do is try and firstly balance the number of alerts that they have, or incidents they have to manage. So, that speaks to increasing staffing costs around trying to work the kind of manual reviews and other things. So that's one of the first things they're looking at, while minimizing false positive ratios, and also looking at obviously stopping fraud. So the false positive ratio and the number of incidents looked at are really high on people's lists. So I think that just speaks to kind of an ever-growing fraud problem, dollar value rising as well. So, trying to maximize on the resource that you have while utilizing external tools that are available, some of them not always at cost, is kind of where the industry is going.
Yeah, exactly. And, so as you guys identified, a lot of fraud, comes through and it sort of ends up into chargebacks. How should agents prepare themselves to win chargeback disputes in today's environment? Tony?
Yeah, this is Trevor. I can. Okay.
Trevor, thank you.
Go ahead, Trevor. Take the lead.
Okay. Yeah. On this one, it's really, there was actually a seminar that we did a webinar a couple weeks ago as well, and a lot of it comes down to clearly defining the items on the receipt, and especially fees. Bolstering the evidence that you're providing back to not only include proof of receipt, but the consumption and usage. Our view of the world is, don't wait for the chargeback. If we're waiting for the chargeback, you're already investing in a significant amount of cost to get there, especially in the agency where you get those ABMs and you have little capability these days to fight the chargeback. How about providing this information right as soon as that customer opens up a dispute? And the stats here is 1 in 5 chargeback disputes results in a win. But how much can we prevent from even becoming a chargeback through that increased collaboration? And I think, what you'll hear and from me throughout is collaboration is key. And why do it? Well, the bad guys are doing it. The fraudsters are out there working together to see how they can extract more value from the merchants or the banks in this ecosystem. And it's about really getting this industry to fight more together, increase the real-time collaboration to make sure we get the proper information when it's needed. Tony?
I don't have much more to add to what Trevor had applied there. Very, very well on point. And again, it goes back to being vigilant and having all your documents in a row, and expect that there will be a potentially a chargeback, be it friendly fraud or criminal fraud, and we have to prepare for it. So as the rise of fraud is recently taken into the travel agent sector of this value chain, it's time for everyone to come to an awareness of all the tools that are reasonably available to them to position adequately and try to prevent this from impacting the bottom line. So that's all I'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if we're talking specifically to chargebacks and, around all of that defense and everything else that goes with it, clearly having the data available, but there's several things you can do around the automation of the defense. So really, pulling in data early, so ahead of receiving a chargeback, having the data available, and then mounting the defense can all be done in quite an automated fashion. So in a previous organization I worked in, we had early notification on a fraud before it even turned into a chargeback, so we're able to go out there and then without having to wait for the chargeback. In some instances, refunding without the goods being delivered, and all these other things. So you can actually start to reduce the impact in staffing overhead by automating the process as well.
Right. Brilliant. Yeah, so here we are dealing with a chargeback that's coming through the system now. Is there anything through terms and conditions, click to accept, anything else that the agents can do, sort of to build up towards fighting this chargeback that you can recommend? Is there anything else that an agent can do to prepare? You mentioned the documentation, but is there anything else while that transaction is happening on the agent's website? Is there anything else that they can make sure and include that if that chargeback does come through, that they've got the right documentation in place?
I think the only other thing that I might add is access to and utilization of the passenger manifest to give proof of that passenger taking those goods and services and using that as a defense with respect to a chargeback as it starts to take shape. And I don't know what kind of access is available to them in that area, whether it's through the administrative office of the master travel agent license and registration or what source it is. But I do always envision that that is a great source to prove that my passenger took this flight for these dollars. And that's very, very important proof of evidence that they have enjoyed the flight. Social media scrapes as well too. We've seen some people do that to dispute chargebacks as well. So I just want to add that little element.
Okay, great, thanks, Tony.
Yeah, this is Trevor. I think there's only two more that I'd add to that. One is just, you know, clearly define the items on the receipt, especially the fees. Make sure there's a very clear differentiation of what each fee is for. And trying to ensure that the refund policies are made very clear to them. I mean, your ideal is not to have, at the end of the day, the customer call the bank first. You'd want them to call you first and give you an opportunity to try to address the situation. So make it as clear as possible that they can do this on the receipt, in addition to, you know, ultimately making sure that the fees are very well clearly laid out.
That's great. That's great input. Thank you.
Great. I'm just going to interrupt real quick to just ask for a clarification here. Friendly fraud, can maybe Cornelius or Doug just kind of really review what that means before we continue on?
Okay. This is Doug, and I'll take friendly fraud, and a lot of people in our industry do not like this term. Some people call it first-party fraud.
What's fraud, right?
Fraud is fraud. But it is when a cardholder purchases that ticket and then for whatever reason has buyer's remorse. Maybe they don't make the flight. Sometimes there's a service issue. I've even heard of someone who did not like the hamburger that they had on the flight and charged back a portion of the ticket. But it is basically the cardholder doing it, and the bank backing them up, and then it resulting in a chargeback. And the agency that issues the ticket ends up having to eat it, and that is it frustrates everyone. There's really very few ways you can build a fraud detection system around it, because all of the information provided up front is all valid, and yet it can still result in a chargeback, unfortunately.
And I think what we see in the travel environment is that a lot of the chargebacks that we do get is friendly fraud chargebacks. You know, there's a failure somewhere along the line that on this tour or in the package deal that the consumer took, there was a service failure. The room wasn't as expected, the transportation wasn't as expected, or something has failed, and that the customer would charge back that entire trip because they can't just do the partial trip chargeback. So again, I think this dials back to make sure terms and conditions are clear and concise. The consumer is aware of them. Your refund policies are shared with them, etc. Trevor, I think you've hit the mark there on some other points as well. I don't know if anybody else on the panel want to add to that before we move on.
The only thing I'll say is that the friendly fraud, it can transpire from, you know, several different sources, and you know, whether it's the same, let's say fraudster or same customer, but it could be benign in nature, whereby it's someone's family member, it might be your spouse, it might be your children that use the card, and then the actual primary cardholder doesn't recognize the transaction and calls their bank, and it could be as simple as someone just doesn't recognize what's on the billing statement. So there's another opportunity there to make sure that, you know, your billing descriptor that appears, make it very clear as to what it's for. You know, possibly if it's a baggage fee, put that in the billing descriptor, so on and so forth. And I think it gets down though also to where it's more abusive in nature too by the cardholder, someone that knows the system, knows the regulations that are, you know, paramount in the U.S. as it pertains to how a bank has to manage a claim, a fraud claim from a cardholder, And some of them try to take advantage of that and try to push through a claim that results in a chargeback ending up in your lap. And that's the more abusive behavior. And for us, it's about how do we stop that behavior in the first place, and how do we enable information sharing to stop it from ever becoming a chargeback, let alone a fraud.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Trevor. So we're going to move on to the next slide, which is fraud management. We saw from the previous slide that there is a significant cost in doing business. We see that in the current state, most agents still use manual processes to manage fraud, with only a small percentage of agents having some form of automation in place. As travel agencies adopt new e-commerce, m-commerce abilities, and plugging into third-party booking tools, what should agents take into account as they adopt these new ways of doing business and ensuring they manage associated fraud? Simon, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So some of the kind of things to think about, or I certainly do anyway, is looking at things around authentication, and these are particularly in the E and M commerce spaces. So I'm not just talking about standard authentication, whatever we can think of as that, but looking at address verification and potential third parties to do that around email or physical address, looking at the device used and consistency, things around, potentially one-time use passwords or other account verification. Clearly it's shifting that way a little bit more, but 3DS, so verification that way, and then other things like obviously social media and these sorts of things, and really other authentication as well in terms of third-party sites, and making sure that there's no kind of intermediary stepping in where they should not be. So man in the middle, man in the browser, these sorts of things to keep the journey clean. And one of the things that we obviously look at is then change your anomaly detection across the customer life cycle. So this is looking at how the customer usually shops versus how they're shopping now, or how they're now interacting with their account, and these sorts of things. So those are the sorts of things I would anticipate taking into account in those channels.
Tony, Trevi, want to add anything to that? Because I think we've got a couple of questions in. Or not?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to it is just know your customer. You already have a channel with that customer today. As you adopt other channels, one of your initial priorities should be is how am I going to recognize my good customers in those other channels? Because that's the last thing you want to decline, is as you offer more channels and your customers use those channels, that you're actually declining them. So ensure you think about how you recognize your customer across different channels, whether that's their mobile number, whether I understand their devices, leveraging some of the data services that are out there to be able to check the integrity of a device or relate, phone numbers to devices, so on and so forth.
Right on point there. And just to add, we do have to remain prepared and aware to accept commerce transaction world, particularly with our tech-savvy millennial population and their mobile phone usage as well too. So it's a perfect storm for mobile commerce when you look at its ease of use on the device itself, and the rapid adoption of this by way of this entirely new generation that's taken place right here at this point in time. So between that and the fact that when a manual review is done, it should be done on any new customer rather than a long-standing customer, and utilizing any resources available to do a check on that new customer is very, very important prior to accepting that transaction. Back to you, Cornelius.
Yeah, thanks. Simon, I don't know, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. If we kind of go back to Trevor's point as well around the kind of false positives for declining your genuine customers. Depending on how your systems are set up, that can be something that you can do relatively easily if you're looking to kind of assign a unique customer ID at inception, and then looking to track them against that. And then you can start to add in different devices, IPs, that sort of thing, to build up a picture of them so that you don't have to get them jumping through these hoops.
Thanks, Simon.
Yeah, and there's another question that's come in for either my colleagues here, Doug or Cornelius, or the folks on the panel. How can an agency protect themselves against friendly fraud, like buying remorse? What backup data or information can be used for e-commerce?
This is Trevor. I can take that one out at the beginning if you want. What we do on the friendly fraud side, ultimately, listen, these customers are calling their bank initially, right? And their banks are having this conversation, and they're having the conversation with a very limited amount of information at their disposal. And that information is technically what the cardholder sees on the statement, plus maybe some of the historical data. So if they see your billing descriptor, they don't know what that purchase was for. And they may ask, and they do ask some basic questions to say, hey, have you tried contacting the merchant? Or, is this potentially a baggage fee? Because they know, generally speaking, what the cardholders will dispute different transactions for. But imagine now a world where they actually had access to the details direct from you at that time when the customer is on the phone. That included the actual receipt of what was purchased. So they don't just see it's, OTA.com and it's $169. They actually see exactly what was purchased. And if you happen to be leveraging some of these new channels like m-commerce, so on and so forth, you might have an understanding of the device that it was purchased from. And being able to provide in these details along with the refund policies and even the contact details, say, hey, contact the merchant directly if you want to dispute this directly with them, but this doesn't look like fraud. And these are the type of things that we're powering to try to stem friendly fraud, because by empowering not only the bank with that information while they're on the phone with them, but also even if that cardholder just goes to their mobile statement or .com statement and can see a bit more information about it, making that available in real time will help decrease that friendly fraud rate significantly.
Excellent points there, Trevor. And to add to that, we always have to be mindful of the bank's mindset as well too. They view that they own that customer. And as a former banker and 25 years in financial services, I do know that typically if we have a customer with a credit card, we have another 2.5 relationships with that customer for a total of 3.5 relationships altogether, or products into that customer. So often, unfortunately, the bank will often side with the customer that's calling in on that complaint, if you will, because they want to protect and preserve their customer. So very good points there, Trevor, but we also need to be mindful of the bank's mindset as they're dealing with that, and that means that the agent themselves need to be that much more prepared with their documentation to support the rejection of that.
Yeah, thank you both. So we still here on the slide of fraud management, and as we've identified, a lot of our travel agency business is going online. It's becoming card not present environment. And it seems to be becoming the status quo. How should agents prepare to manage this new way? I mean, we've touched on a couple of points there, but just wondering if there's anything else that we need to add here that we can reflect on. Simon, I think this one will help. Maybe on your side.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the card not present space, I mean, it is, I guess, becoming the norm in terms of fraud. It is happening on all channels, less and less so in brick and mortar, simply because those sales are starting to fall off a little bit, I guess. But in terms of preparing to manage that, I would, talk about the resourcing. Making sure that resourcing is smart in terms of where you assign it. And I always kind of think of it in terms of looking at the very first interaction with the customer and seeing that as a really core focus, because what you can stop at the beginning, you don't have to defend at the end. So with that in mind, you then look at the partners, whether that's something you need to go out external for different data sources, different tools, whether that's something you want to build in-house. And then kind of constantly evaluating the data that's at your disposal to then start to look at the different MO of fraud of your good customers, and then looking at market trends, and then the supplier capabilities against those market trends to give yourself the best chance you can at preparing for the fraud that's going to be coming down the line.
And when you look at the elements of the AVS, it's certainly a requirement to move along the transaction, but it is not the end all. And we had a great presentation just the other day with the NCFTA, and that involved Homeland Security and Secret Service as well too. And they were showing us slides, and we all know this, Simon and Trevor and myself and the entire organization there at ARC, but all this stuff is available and bought and sold on a daily basis. So the utilization of a 16-digit card and a name and address and billing zip and AVS and everything of that nature is information that fraudsters, who are very sophisticated in their actions, they already have this at their fingertips. So it's very easy to get taken by a fraudster, even if he has all the information that you request as it applies to the credit card conditions. So therefore, I'd like to, re-emphasize what Simon had indicated, that it's important for the use of external resources and other databases that are available so that you can make the right decision, again, with new customers primarily. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. So, building on that, we know that manual reviews is still to be done. AVS checks, CVN checks is still to be done. There's a myriad of tools out there for agents to use to identify fraud and so forth. Is there a magic number of tools out there or techniques that need to be applied in order to manage fraud? In your opinion, Simon?
So I guess in terms of an absolute number, it's the kind of balance between the fraud rate and then the amount that you're going to spend, because ultimately you could spend a ton of money on buying every new fraud solution that comes along with every new data source, and that's going to get you what you want, but potentially isn't going to outweigh the the cost of that. I guess for me, it's taking it right back and understanding your business, understanding the cost of fraud, so that's not just chargeback value or lost bookings. It's the cost of your fraud solution or external partners, the cost of your manual review team and everything else to give you an absolute dollar value on that, and then you can start to play that back to your revenue and your profitability, essentially to give you an idea of what the amount of revenue you need to generate is to cover that cost. And then you can start to understand hey, look, is this a big issue, or have I got the right tools in place where actually this number isn't too big? The cost of fraud in its entirety isn't a large dollar value on bookings coming in, if you were to translate it into that. So that way you can start to, if the numbers look like wildly different, you can start to use that to build a business case, because you need to engage with other suppliers. If it's looking like it's in a good place, then potentially you've got the right mix. but ultimately it is on a business by business basis, and it's understanding all of the different mix to your cost base that you can do that.
Right. Trevor, you've got anything to add? Doug?
Yeah, I think that covered it nicely. I think the only thing I'd add to it is depending on the OTA and the size of the OTA, it kind of will dictate the amount of investment you can make. And there's lots of options in the industry. You can, starting with you could essentially outsource your decision, which has some benefits in that they typically take the risk of the decision on a given transaction, so they take the liability of the transaction, but you pay a higher fee for that. Versus you take the risk of your own decisions internally, and you implement a platform and a set of tools to go along with that. And I think the key there is that's great and all, but as was mentioned, you got to manage it in line with your total cost of fraud, and also know though that the fraudsters and the rings that are out there will continue to evolve. That when you invest there, that the key is to invest in a platform that really enables you to change rapidly as well, to change essentially the demand that the fraudsters are imposing at your doorstep to get better.
Right.
Okay. Oh, we have a question came in. If I were to open a public-facing online site, how many reviewers should I expect to have to hire? How many, meaning how many transactions are they expected to review in a given hour? Does anyone have any insight into manual review caseload?
Well, let me get it started, and we'll let Simon and Trevor reach in from there. That's a pretty broad brushed question, but trying to give some context to it. What we have found is new OTAs that are B2C, not a B2B play, but a B2C play. They experience a tremendous amount of fraud in their early months. And I suspect maybe these very sophisticated fraudster rings recognize they might not have tools in place, and they go at them. And we have seen as high as a 7% fraud ratio of those transactions on new ones. And we have practices that we deploy to bring that down to a reasonable state. So in a steady state, be it 1 or 2 quarters later, but in a steady state, it's reasonable to assume that anywhere from 2 to 4% of your transactions are going to be suspect in nature with their characteristics, and therefore require a manual review. Now you can see very much on this slide right here that in some instances, smaller agencies, as high as 63% of the transactions are going through manual review. So it's safe to say that somewhere in a steady state, mind you, 2 to 4% of these transactions are going to be suspect in nature, and they're going to require a manual review. So there you have to take those conditions and factor that into your volume. If your volume is 100 transactions a month, or if your volume is 1,000 transactions a month, or 10,000 transactions a month for those that we serve in our portfolio as well too, that in itself will dictate whether you need 2, 6, or 12 analysts on your team that live, eat, and breathe this process.
Absolutely. So, I mean, some of the other things are around kind of volume they can work per hour, which then allows you to say my kind of transaction number is X, my likely fraud is going to be 4 or 7% of that. So how many people do I need to work to get through these? So it's not necessarily an exact science. It depends on, I guess, the level of data that is available to you within the UI of the solution that you're using to combat fraud. So if you're just getting something spat out to you that says this looks bad, and you have to dip around to different systems to try and pull together this information to find out actually, you know, is the address the same and all these other things, it could take you a while just to review one. But if you can have tools that allow you all of the data in one place, so this is pulling out to maps, this is giving you the device data, all of the IP and the geolocation, some triangulation, a history of the shopper's spend, all of this good stuff in one place, then you can review many more transactions in that time period. So you then balance that with the higher dollar value transactions where you're going to want to spend a bit more time because you don't want to generate any false positives. And you could maybe get to, I don't know, ballpark figure, let's say 10 an hour, 5 to 10 an hour. You might have some that you can group together, so it may be many more if you spot a fraud ring. But somewhere of that kind of magnitude, I guess.
Excellent. All right, so I'd say let's move on to the future of fraud. You know, I just came back from Madrid attending the Out of Fraud conference there, and it was clear that fraud is an ever-growing concern in the travel industry. And Trevor, you said it. Tony, you said it as well. I think we've been discussing it throughout the month. You know, collaboration is key, and that was another message that I took away from that session, as well as that we need to collaborate. We know, Trevor, you mentioned that the fraudsters collaborate. You know, we on fighting fraud definitely need to collaborate as well. We already reflected in the advancements of technology and how travel is shifting into the e-commerce world. However, it would seem that as these new methods of doing business are adopted, that a similar effort is in fighting fraud is also required. We've seen on the previous slide that, you know, only a small percentage of agents have some form of automation in place, you know. So, you know, as we went through the past month, we looked at some new techniques, technologies, and best practices to detect and prevent fraud. Reflecting on this, what would you recommend to agents, breaking it down, or, you know, the small agents, mid-sized agents, and even to our OTAs? What would be your recommendations be there in how to manage risk? I'm just going to leave it open. Anybody can jump in if you feel ready for it.
I'll start because these guys do a great job building on top of where I left off. So I would say that for the smaller agencies, the battle is between budget and managing the losses as well too. So we know that the brand enterprises and the larger OTAs, or let's say the largest 4 or 5, certainly have these 7-digit budgets. That can't be expected or found at the mid to small size travel agency, although they're very important contributors to the ecosystem. So that being said, I think a mere inquiry or query into some of the industry's database tools that are available, and not to turn this into a commercial, but, you know, in our Perseuss environment, we carry a global record of known fraudsters as built by the community itself, from the brands to the OTAs and such. So an inquiry into a database to say, do we have this actor recorded yet, and where has he been, what space has he been playing in, and to what impact to the industry, positive or negative, as well too. Again, the large OTAs, they have their automated processes, and as do the brands as well too. So proprietary data, as Trevor and Simon were touching on before, knowing your customer, building a file on your customer, the opportunity to query into the travel industry's database that are available out there to assist in making that manual review determination as well too. And of course, the higher the volume of the transactions and the value of the ticket warrants a very thorough review of these transactions before they're accepted, because once you turn them in, you are at the mercy of the repercussion of what happens when this bad actor performs under the brand's name, and it comes back to you in the form of an ADM. So every query that's available, I would encourage that it's taken place at the onset of accepting the transaction. Over to you guys.
Yeah, I would. I agree with that, and I think it all comes down to, you know, how big is your business and what do you have to invest. And obviously, the bigger you are, the more volume you get, the more automation you're going to want. And I think Tony brought some very good points to the table, that there are tools out there in the industry that enable you to do more manual-facing lookups on web portals, whether that's a Perseuss, whether that's taking a look at a white pages. To be able to try to identify that someone lives at a certain address, or whether or not it's taking a look at some of the device ID companies that are out there to try to map devices. There are these services and resources that are out there that you could begin to use manually to try to assess that the order is actually from a good customer. And then as you begin to evolve, then you can take a look at automation and whether you're getting into automatic decision making, where they take on the risk for you, whether you're leveraging something like 3D Security where the risk goes away from you as well. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to the level of investment you want to make, which is a factor of the volume that you're getting in today, to be able to determine what tools in the industry make sense for you.
Absolutely, and I completely agree. The third-party call-outs are exceptionally cost-effective because you don't necessarily need to initiate them all the time. You can look at those as and when you just need that additional data. Some of the other things that, especially if, you know, it's a new thing in terms of moving into E or M commerce, is you're going to usually have a payment gateway who will, generally speaking, have a fraud prevention tool baked in. If you're not using a dedicated payment gateway and you're going through your processor and they've got something baked in, again, on top of that, they'll normally have a fraud prevention tool, which can normally work out relatively cost effective in terms of a few cents on a transaction. And some of the things to do is, even before all of that, you can still know your own data. So whether that's just doing a lookup in Excel, you can still take time to look at your good data, look at your bad data, look for patterns of time and value and location, or alternatively, the IP is, you know, not necessarily consistent, or you need to just look it up and it looks like it's spoofed or something like that. So these are things that you can do at the kind of outset, which are relatively cost effective and can save you a ton of fraud with some really simple rules just around time of day, dollar value, and, you know, then looking at those in combination with potentially departure airports and things like that. So yeah, there's quite a lot you can do with not that much investment, and then as things ramp up, you just need to automate those, but that would come with the volume that you're putting through.
And perhaps one subject matter expert in any given office that can put on that filter and assist in performing those services. Because we know, as does the entire ARC team, you know, Simon, Trevor, and I, we deal with the analyst community on a daily and a weekly basis. We know how they think, we know what they do full time, we know their pain points, we appreciate their passion in combating fraud. It's really impressive, their dedication and passion to that. But we also respectfully recognize that a travel agent enjoys interfacing with a customer and building a package and creating a great customer experience and wearing a completely different filter. And so to push you into this arena that you have to take off your rose-colored glasses and put dark ones on and dealing with your prospects in a suspicious manner is probably a bit of a conflict in itself. And that conflict is no different from what the enterprises deal with, but they put solutions in to do most of the heavy lifting for them. So my closing words of encouragement would be one key person in every office, that when a transaction is a bit questionable, that you hand it over to that person that wears that mental hat and can do these technical checkpoints so that you can stay positive with your customer while somebody else is handling that. And I think that might be a practice to take into consideration. That's all.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. We're coming to a close on our time here as well. So if anybody on the call want to put in some questions, please get those to us as soon as possible as we work towards wrapping up this session. Guys, I mean, the holiday seasons are coming up. We've touched on a lot of pointers here. Any closing thoughts? I mean, around the holiday season, what should people be looking out for? Or just in general, what would be your closing thoughts here on this discussion?
This is Trevor here. So I'd say I'd summarize this call. Number one is know your customers. Know your good customers and their families. Those are the most important customers at times of your business because those are the ones that keep on returning and returning. And the last thing you want to do is you don't want to see these guys be in decline. Get them out of your manual review cycles unless there's a significant risk that comes up in one of the data checks that if you have automated data checks. And then continue to leverage and collaborate with your peers in the industry. There's lots of resources out there. There's the Merchant Risk Council, which is both in Europe and the U.S. That provides a lot of good resources to really educate you how you might be able to better fight fraud, how you might be able to establish some fraud solutions, whether manual or automated in the ecosystem. And then ultimately consider how you might get to automated detection solutions in the future that ingest these third-party data sources relevant to your business, that identify and separate bad from good actors, and continue to leverage collaboration as you move forward. And I keep on telling everybody that we talk to is that the bad guys are doing it. They're working together. You need to team up with your industry, with your peers, whether that's in travel or maybe it's in e-retail, and understand the best practices and the data sources that enable you to better detect fraud while ensuring you don't decline your good customers.
And that's an excellent point, Trevor, because they are very sophisticated with our hierarchy. Everyone has their skill set. They know when to push something to somebody else to perform, where one party might be good at an enterprise breach, another party might be very good at spearing down into accounts for account takeover and such. And they know this is their season, this fourth quarter that's coming around. There's going to be tremendous volumes taking place, not only in the travel sector, but the e-commerce sector as well too. So I would encourage a set of rules that one would be to check that you have this customer in your customer database, and then you can have a different workflow process when they are a known customer with successful transactions. And if they are not a known customer in your travel base, then you want to have a different workflow process that performs a little bit of qualifying, external checkpoints, and other conditions before fully accepting that transaction. So this is a season to gear up for that in your workflow processes and to be vigilant against these parties that they like to jump into this high traffic as well too, because they figure they get overlooked a little bit easier. So in this fourth quarter, while commerce in general will have a substantial uptick, so will the fraud activity, because they'll just blend right on into the current traffic.
Yeah, I mean, really nicely put. I mean, getting the good customers out of your queue, clearing down, getting ready. I mean, the sorts of things that everyone looks for as a fraudster is obviously, and to prevent fraud is looking for your standard short time between booking and departure, high value, time of day, out of hours, weekend bookings, all these sorts of things. It is going to happen. They do target this time of year. They are talking about it. And we need to just make sure we leverage everything in our arsenal to try and prevent it.
Okay. Well, that's been great, guys. And I'm going to hand over to Judy.
Yeah, like Cornelia said, if there is anyone on the phone, we have had some good questions, and Cornelia, has presented some excellent questions and for conversation and discussion with the panel this afternoon. So if anyone on the phone still has some questions, please go to the control panel, type them in. There is one that came in regards to, is there any place agents can go to find out some successful anti-fraud software packages. Is there, for maybe Cornelius and Doug here with me, is there a resource?
Yeah, there is a website that aggregates a lot of the industry providers, and it's called about-fraud, ABOUT-fraud.com. And I know a number of the, I know Perseuss is on there. I'm sure the others are on there as well. But it does list out the solution provider name and kind of what their focus is on. So it's a good place to start, about-fraud.com, to do some research as to providers for our industry that can help.
Great. Thanks, Doug. Does anyone on the panel have anything to add to that? Okay.
I'd second the about fraud. I know Trevor mentioned MRC earlier as well. And then, those two certainly do stick out as good places to learn more. I mean, I also, coming from a PCI background, you can also go through to the PCI website and look at all of the certified vendors, but that's just me geeking out a bit.
The affirmation.
Thank you. And we did get a question in regards to why would ARC, if we're talking about fraud and stuff, send out emails with, there may be an agency's I add a number in the subject line. We can take that offline and we'll work with you separately on that. I'm not sure when that happens, so we will contact you to understand that a little bit better, but it's a good question. Thank you. Some of the other things that we have on the screen right now, of course, is if you do suspect fraud, it's the old saying, if you suspect something, say something. Cornelius and Doug's information is here up on the screen, their email addresses, and also we do have the fraud hotline. You see the email that's up here, the stopfraud@arccorp.com. The other thing is the hotline number for those of you that want to call in and actually speak to someone, and that number is 855-358-0393. Again, 855-358-0393. Before I get to the next slide, which I'll talk about our conference, a lot of you have asked if this is being recorded. It is. All of our recordings from this month, this is our last webinar in the series of 10 for the month of September. They will all be posted on our arccorpsite.com in October, so look for those there. I'm also going to work with our marketing department to potentially post the PowerPoint presentations as well. If we can't do that, those will be sent out individually. So look for those in the next week or two to come into your mailbox for whichever session you attended. The next slide that I just want to review before we let you go is our Travel Connect conference, which is happening on October 11th through the 12th. It kicks off with a reception on Wednesday night, the 10th. We have a full day on the 11th and a half day on the 12th, but it's really, really a nice opportunity to, again, meet and network with ARC, but it's also with your agents or airline counterparts. And we have some GDSs there as well, but it will be really informational and kind of where the industry is today and where some of the keynote speakers see it going. So we hope to see you there. You can still register for that. You can go to where it has it on the screen, arctravelconnect.com, and you can go there and you can register for that for our 5th annual conference. But I want to just take the time before we end here today to thank you all for joining us on the call. I know some of you have been on multiple webinars with us this month, and we really thank you. We hope this information has been helpful. Again, we will continue to help you fight fraud with webinars. I know Cornelius and Doug are always constantly looking at ways to help you. You can go to the fraud website on arccorp.com, and they will have white papers, other pertinent information. But again, if you suspect something, say something. We're here to help. And I want to give, again, a warm thank you to all of our guest panelists on the phone today, which is Tony, Simon, and Trevor. Thanks so much for your time. Cornelius and Doug, I've been sitting with you throughout this month, and thank you. Your team has done a great job putting this together. But most of all, our customers on the phone, thanks for hanging in there. And hopefully we'll see you next time. There's two webinars coming up before the end of the year. One is with Delta Airlines. We'll have 6 folks from Delta on the phone, and that's going to be happening on October 25th. Hope you can join us for that. I think that'll be really helpful and, again, informative. And then we'll have American Airlines on the phone, and that will be in early December. And I don't have the exact date nailed down yet, but look for that more information to come on both of those sessions. But Delta will be on October 25th. Look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Cornelius, Doug, Tony, Simon, and Trevor.
Thank you, everyone.
Great rest of the day.
Bye-bye.